The sun was just dipping behind the trees when Daniel turned off the highway and followed the narrow dirt path toward the campsite, the air already carrying the fresh scent of pine and damp earth. He could feel a mix of excitement and tension knotting in his stomach. This trip was meant to be a pause from life, a weekend to breathe and reconnect with Emily, his wife, who had been quietly pulling away from him for months, her smile polite but her eyes distant, and Daniel knew that somewhere in her quietness there was a storm he had not noticed. Emily sat in the passenger seat, looking out the window at the passing trees. The last few months had been hard on both of them, long hours at work, small arguments that didn't get solved, and nights spent side by side but not really together. Daniel had suggested a short trip before, but Emily had insisted on this one, saying she needed fresh air, and he had agreed, secretly hoping that a weekend in nature might bring back the warmth they had been losing. The car came to a stop near a small clearing, the campsite tucked just at the edge of the lake, its surface already reflecting the deep orange and purple of the evening sky. The smell of wet leaves and water hit Daniel first, and then the sound of birds settling for the night. The scene should have been calming, but his nerves were alive, buzzing, as if he knew that this weekend might be more than just a break from routine. It might be a turning point, a moment where the truth would reveal itself. Mark and Sarah were already there, setting up their tent, laughing softly at a joke Mark had just made. Their ease with each other made Daniel feel both comforted and anxious. He wanted that same closeness with Emily but didn't know how to reach her. The fire pit was partially built, logs stacked neatly, and the smell of pine mingled with faint smoke from a small flame Mark had started earlier. It felt like stepping into another world, one where ordinary worries were paused, replaced with the simple tasks of building a camp and settling into nature. Emily stepped out of the car, carrying a small backpack, her movements graceful but quiet, and Daniel noticed immediately how different she looked in the soft evening light, the gold and pink reflecting on her hair, her face calm but thoughtful, her eyes scanning the trees rather than meeting his. There was a tension there he couldn't name yet, a quiet he hadn't heard before, and it made him ache. He wanted to reach out, to touch her hand, to ask her to smile at him, but the words got stuck in his throat. The four of them worked together to set up tents, though Daniel noticed how Emily's hands moved slowly, how she hesitated when Mark tried to joke with her, and even though she laughed politely, it didn't reach her eyes. It was a subtle difference. But Daniel felt it immediately, a small warning that tonight might not be the easy, carefree evening he had hoped for. He tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself that maybe she was just tired, or thinking about work, or maybe just adjusting to being outside the city. As the sun sank lower, they built the fire completely, the flames catching and dancing over the logs, throwing shadows across their faces. The light was warm, the kind that makes people relax. Daniel watched Emily as she settled on a log near the fire, a blanket over her legs, and for a moment, he saw her truly, the way she leaned slightly forward, the way her eyes caught the firelight, her lips soft but not smiling fully. It was a quiet beauty, but it was also fragile, delicate, as if she could drift away if he didn't pay attention. They started talking around the fire, sharing stories from past trips, laughing at old mistakes, and Daniel could hear Emily's laughter, soft and careful, a sound he had not heard in a long time. It made his heart lift, but at the same time, it reminded him of the distance he had allowed to grow between them. He realized that their marriage had been running on routines and obligations. The small joys had been lost in the busyness, and this weekend was supposed to bring those joys back, but already, the signs of unspoken tension were there. Mark and Sarah moved closer together, holding hands, whispering jokes, and Daniel couldn't help but notice the ease between them, the kind of connection that comes naturally when people truly understand each other. It made him feel envious and hopeful at the same time. He wanted that same closeness with Emily, wanted to feel her hand in his, her head resting on his shoulder without thinking, but he also feared asking for it, afraid it might push her further away if he demanded intimacy too soon. Emily finally stood up, her blanket slipping from her shoulders as she walked toward the lake, her movements quiet, deliberate. Daniel felt an immediate pull to follow, a sudden need to reach her before the night took a different shape, but he hesitated, frozen by uncertainty, unsure if he should respect her space or let her feel his concern. And that hesitation, that single pause, was heavy in his chest, because sometimes the smallest decisions, the moments we let slip, can become the memories that haunt us later. The lake was calm, the surface smooth and reflecting the stars as they began to appear, and Daniel followed slowly, careful not to make a sound, his mind racing with thoughts of what she might be thinking, feeling, or hiding. When he finally reached her, she was sitting on a fallen log, knees pulled to her chest, her gaze fixed on the water. She didn't look at him at first, and Daniel felt a pang of fear, worried that he had missed something important, that the distance had already become too large to bridge with words. He sat down beside her, just a few feet away, the silence between them filled with the sounds of nature, the rustling leaves, distant frogs, the occasional bird settling for the night. He wanted to speak, to ask her what she was feeling, to reach for her hand. But the words seemed too heavy, too slow, and he realized that sometimes presence mattered more than speaking, that being there, simply sitting together, was a start. Emily finally looked at him, her eyes reflecting the moonlight and the tiny sparks of the fire behind them. She didn't speak immediately, but the way she shifted slightly toward him was enough, a subtle gesture that said she was open to sharing. If not yet ready to pour out everything inside, Daniel felt a mixture of hope and fear, understanding that the night might bring clarity, but also knowing that truth could hurt, and the lessons they needed to learn were not simple, they were wrapped in the quiet moments, in the pauses, in what was not said as much as what was. As they returned to the campsite, the fire now burning low, the others settling into their tents, Daniel felt a strange mix of relief and tension. The first part of the night had passed, but the real part, the one that would test their connection, had yet to arrive. And he knew that the quiet moments by the lake had already begun shaping the weekend, already beginning to reveal truths he had been avoiding, truths about Emily, about himself, about the choices they had made together and separately. That first night was gentle, yes, with laughter and warm firelight, but it was also fragile, like glass, easy to admire but ready to crack under pressure. And Daniel understood that this camping trip was not just a break from life, it was a mirror, showing them both what had been lost and what could still be saved, if they paid attention, if they chose each other in those small, quiet ways that mattered more than words or gestures. The night was young, but the lesson was already whispering in the cool breeze and the calm lake, a lesson that neither of them could ignore. As he lay in the tent that night, listening to the gentle crackle of the dying fire, the occasional owl in the trees, and Emily breathing softly beside him, Daniel realized that this weekend would be remembered, not for the activities, not for the food or the walk, but for the first hints of understanding, the first moments where silence spoke louder than conversation, and where love, even when fragile, could begin to heal if given care and attention. The night had begun, and so had the lessons. Quietly, gently, with the kind of power that only truth and reflection could bring. The night air was cooler near the lake, carrying a hint of pine and water, and Daniel could feel the tension in his chest growing as he watched Emily sit on the fallen log, hugging her knees, staring at the reflection of the moon in the still water. The way she held herself was quiet but heavy, and he realized that she had been holding on to something for a long time, something unspoken, a weight he hadn't noticed until now. He stepped closer, careful not to startle her, the soft crunch of leaves under his shoes breaking the silence just enough to make her look up, her eyes reflecting surprise, then relief, a faint warmth that he had been craving for months. He sat down beside her without speaking, letting the quiet stretch between them, understanding that sometimes words could not reach the heart as effectively as presence. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice soft but steady, telling him that she felt invisible, not unloved, not unwanted, but unseen, like she had been there all along and no one noticed the small things that made her who she was, the laughter she tried to hide, the quiet sadness she carried, the moments she needed connection but got routine instead. Daniel's throat tightened. He realized immediately that he had been part of this distance, that his focus on work, distractions, and comfort had left a space between them that grew quietly, steadily, until it was nearly impossible to ignore. He wanted to speak, to reassure her, but the words stumbled in his mouth, too clumsy, too slow, too ordinary to capture the depth of what she was feeling. Instead he reached out, tentatively brushing a strand of hair from her face, and she didn't move away. A small gesture but enough to start the shift, enough to let him understand that empathy mattered more than apologies in that moment, more than quick reassurances or empty promises. Emily continued, her voice trembling slightly as she confessed that she had been lonely even when surrounded by people, that she had waited for him to notice the small signals, the quiet cries for attention, the subtle longing in her smiles. And Daniel felt a pang of guilt so sharp it made his stomach twist. He had known she was distant but had mistaken it for stress or fatigue, not realizing it was a silent call for him to truly see her, to choose her, to fight for the connection they once had. Back at the campsite, Mark and Sarah were quietly observing from their tent, sensing the tension but giving space. The way Sarah looked at Daniel when he returned later made him realize that someone else had already noticed the change in him, the shift in his heart, and it embarrassed him in a good way, because it reminded him that honesty had weight, that vulnerability could not be hidden, and that love required courage, even when it was uncomfortable. When Daniel and Emily returned, the fire had burned low, casting long shadows on the trees, the crackling flames soft and golden, the night quiet except for the occasional sound of animals settling in, and it felt heavier than before, not bad, but charged. A delicate energy that made him acutely aware of every glance, every touch, every word unspoken. The world had shrunk to that small clearing, to the four of them, and to the truths waiting to be acknowledged. Later, as Mark went to bed, Daniel found himself sitting alone by the fire again, the logs glowing faintly, embers flickering, the night full of gentle sounds, and Sarah joined him without a word, sitting at a respectful distance, her eyes reflecting the firelight, and Daniel sensed that she was going to speak truths he needed to hear, not just about Emily or the weekend, but about himself, about love, about the small, quiet choices that mattered more than grand gestures. In a voice softer than the wind, Sarah said, "Love does not break in loud moments, it breaks in quiet ones, when people stop noticing each other, when the small things are ignored, the smiles not returned, the effort not made," and Daniel felt a sharp clarity, as if someone had pointed a light into the corners he had avoided seeing. He realized that he had been taking Emily's presence for granted, assuming comfort meant connection, and suddenly everything about the weekend made sense. The distance, the polite laughter, the careful gestures, it was a subtle warning he had ignored. He thought back to the lake, to Emily's words, to the weight she carried silently, and he understood that apologies alone would not fix this, that he needed to be present every day, to notice, to choose her intentionally, to show that she mattered not just in words but in actions, and the realization hit him with both relief and urgency, relief because he finally understood, and urgency because he knew change required more than intention, it required action. Emily had not said these words to hurt him, nor had Sarah meant to shame him, but Daniel felt exposed, naked in a way that was uncomfortable but necessary. He realized that love was fragile, that connection was delicate, and that the moments that seemed ordinary were often the ones that defined a relationship, a marriage, a life shared with someone else, and this camping trip, simple as it was, had become the stage for that revelation. He remembered the quiet gestures he had overlooked, the smiles he had failed to return with warmth, the nights when he had chosen distraction over attention, the work he had allowed to push her into silence, and he felt a surge of determination, knowing that the lesson of this night would not fade if he acted on it, if he allowed it to change him, to reshape the way he loved, the way he noticed, the way he chose Emily every day. The fire crackled low, the night deep and vast, and Daniel felt a sense of intimacy with Sarah's words, not romantic, not inappropriate, but human, the kind of guidance that comes when someone speaks truth without judgment. He understood then that the world could teach him lessons in unexpected places, even in quiet conversations by a dying fire, even in moments of self-reflection inspired by friends, even in the discomfort of seeing one's own faults laid bare. As he lay in his tent later, listening to Emily breathing softly beside him, the distant sounds of nocturnal life in the forest, Daniel reflected on the evening, the lake, the fire, the words shared and the truths revealed. And he understood that the night had done something remarkable. It had begun the work of mending, not magically, but slowly, carefully, through honesty, through presence, through the courage to face difficult feelings, the kind of courage he had avoided for too long. Emily, too, seemed lighter, not completely healed, but ready to begin, ready to acknowledge the silence and turn it into connection. Daniel felt a deep love for her in that moment, a love sharpened by understanding, by awareness, by recognition of her needs, and he realized that the camping trip had not been about relaxation or escape. It had been about revelation, about learning to see and be seen, about knowing that the quiet moments often carried the loudest truths. The night stretched on, calm and reflective, and Daniel stayed awake longer than usual, staring at the tiny embers glowing in the fire pit, thinking about how he would carry this lesson forward, how he would ensure that Emily never felt invisible again, how he would notice her laughter, her small gestures, her sighs, her silences, how he would choose her in ways that mattered every day, and the weight of that promise settled into him, heavy but comforting. By the time he finally drifted to sleep, the moon high above the trees, the stars shimmering in the clear sky, Daniel knew that this night would be remembered not for the campfire or the walk or the quiet beauty of the forest, but for the truth that had been revealed, the understanding that had arrived gently, and the lesson that would shape his life and marriage forever, that love required attention, courage, and constant choice, and that the small moments often carried the greatest power. Morning arrived slowly, pale light spilling over the campsite, turning the lake into a soft silver mirror, the cool air brushing against Daniel's face as he stepped out of the tent, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the quiet weight of reflection with him. The night had changed something, revealed something, and the morning felt like a chance to act on it, to start doing what words alone could not fix. Emily was already up, standing near the lake, her hands in the pockets of her hoodie, looking at the water as if seeing it for the first time. Daniel approached slowly, careful not to disturb her stillness, and she didn't look at him immediately, which made his heart tighten in a familiar way, but he understood now that healing and reconnection could not be rushed, they could only be chosen, step by step, moment by moment. The quiet of the morning was filled with the sound of birds waking, the occasional splash of fish in the lake, the rustling of leaves in the gentle wind, and Daniel felt acutely that this was not just another camping trip, it was a turning point. A weekend that would stay with him forever because it had forced honesty, vulnerability, and reflection into the space between him and Emily, the space that had grown quietly for too long. He reached out, taking her hand lightly, just enough for her to feel his presence, and she turned to him, her eyes still cautious but softer than the night before. There was a tentative warmth in her gaze, and he realized that this was the beginning of a new understanding, that the quiet moments of the night had opened the door, and now it was up to both of them to walk through it, together but gently. As they packed up their tents and gear, Daniel noticed the small differences in Emily's movements, the way she laughed softly at a memory Mark shared, the way she adjusted the straps of her backpack without complaint, and he understood that the shift was subtle, like ripples across the water, but it was real, tangible, and encouraging. He could feel the space between them beginning to close, not instantly, not magically, but steadily, through presence and choice. Mark and Sarah were cheerful as always, helping with tents and gear, joking and laughing, and Daniel felt grateful for their support, for their easy companionship, because it reminded him that relationships thrived not just in romantic spaces, but in friendships, in observation, in the way people around you reflect back the truths you might not see yourself. And he realized that even those small examples of connection were important lessons for marriage and life. At breakfast, cooked simply over the remaining embers of the fire, Daniel watched Emily quietly, noticing how she smiled at small things, how she shared memories of work and life in ways that felt open, and he understood that these moments, mundane as they seemed, were actually profound, because they represented attention, presence, and emotional availability, the very things he had lacked before and now wanted to nurture every day. As they drove home, the forest receding behind them, the highway stretching forward, Daniel finally spoke with honesty he had been holding back. He apologized, not quickly, not casually, but slowly, deliberately, acknowledging the distance he had allowed, the times he had failed to see her, the moments when comfort had outweighed effort, and Emily listened, her eyes on the road, the silence between them heavy but meaningful, her quiet acceptance a sign that she understood the sincerity of his words. They didn't solve everything at once, and Daniel knew they wouldn't, but that was okay, because what mattered was beginning to notice, beginning to act, beginning to rebuild trust, warmth, and attention, and he realized that love was not about perfection or grand gestures, it was about the small, daily choices that demonstrated care, patience, and presence, choices he was now committed to making consistently. As the city skyline appeared in the distance, Daniel reflected on the weekend, on the night by the lake, on the words shared around the fire, on the lessons Sarah had whispered into the quiet night, and he understood that life often teaches in subtle ways, in moments of discomfort and reflection, in silence that stretches long enough to force recognition, and in acts of courage small enough to seem ordinary but powerful enough to change everything. Emily finally turned to him, a faint but genuine smile forming, and Daniel felt a surge of love and relief, knowing that this trip had revealed not just what was wrong, but also what was possible, the potential for closeness, for understanding, for shared joy. And he promised himself in that moment to never take her presence for granted again, to notice her, to listen, to choose her in the small ways that truly mattered. The drive home was filled with quiet conversation, easy smiles, and shared memories of the trip, the awkwardness of distance replaced with tentative warmth. And Daniel knew that the lessons of the weekend would continue, not in dramatic gestures, but in consistent, deliberate attention, in showing up emotionally, in being present for her in ways both big and small, ways that truly spoke of love. Back at home, as they unpacked the car and returned to their routine, Daniel noticed how the weekend had changed his perspective, how the quiet revelations had reshaped his priorities, and how the love he felt for Emily was now tempered by understanding, by the awareness that connection requires active choice, and that sometimes the most powerful lessons come not in crises, but in gentle awakenings, quiet realizations, and shared vulnerability. Later that evening, as they sat together in the living room, the soft hum of the city in the background, Daniel reached for Emily's hand again, this time with confidence, and she squeezed back gently, a simple gesture, but one filled with meaning. And he knew that the lessons of the night, the lake, the fire, and the quiet words of friends had not been wasted. They had begun to change the way he loved, the way he noticed, the way he chose to be present every day. He realized that love was not proven in grand trips, or romantic gestures, or dramatic declarations, but in daily presence, in attention to small details, in listening before being asked, in noticing what was quiet and subtle, and in choosing connection even when it was easier to ignore. The camping trip had taught him that lessons often arrived in unexpected ways, wrapped in honesty and discomfort, and that the willingness to see and act on them determined the strength of love. Emily, too, seemed lighter, more open, her energy no longer guarded, the laughter they shared now soft but genuine, the conversations flowing naturally, the tension of previous months easing, and Daniel understood that the weekend had created a foundation, not a perfect resolution, but a start, and that foundations mattered more than perfection, because they were the base on which trust, love, and understanding could grow steadily. That night, as they prepared for bed, Daniel reflected on everything he had learned, the way small gestures mattered, the importance of empathy, the need for deliberate action, and the strength of quiet honesty. He realized that this weekend would stay with him, not just as a memory of a camping trip, but as a turning point in his life, a moment when he understood that love required constant care, and that the lessons of the heart were often gentle but powerful. He watched Emily sleep that night, her breathing calm, her face peaceful, and he felt a deep gratitude for the weekend, for the challenges, for the insights, and for the opportunity to begin again. He promised himself that he would carry this lesson forward every day, choosing connection, attention, and love, not as occasional acts, but as a lifestyle, a commitment to presence, a willingness to see and be seen. And he knew that this was the lesson he would never forget. In the days that followed, Daniel noticed the changes in himself as much as in Emily, the way he listened more attentively, the way he paused to notice her reactions, the way he chose to engage in meaningful ways rather than routine, the way he carried the memory of the lake, the fire, and the quiet night with Sarah's words echoing in his mind, reminding him that love breaks in silence unless carefully tended, and he vowed to tend it daily. The camping trip, simple as it seemed at first, had revealed the depth of human connection, the importance of noticing, of courage, of reflection, and the power of quiet lessons. It had shown him that love could be fragile, but also resilient. if nurtured, and that some nights, some moments, some truths could change the course of a life, guiding hearts back to each other when distance had grown too quietly, too slowly, to be ignored. As Daniel and Emily settled back into routine, the lessons of the weekend remained alive, reminding them both that attention, empathy, and choice mattered more than comfort, more than routine, more than silent assumption, that love was not just about being together, but about seeing, hearing, and choosing each other consistently, and that the nights spent by the lake, the conversations by the fire, and the quiet realizations would continue to guide them, shaping a relationship stronger and more aware than before. And in the stillness of their home, the faint memory of the forest, the lake, the fire, and the soft night air lingered, a reminder that some lessons are unforgettable, that some moments demand change, and that the quiet courage to see, feel, and act is what sustains love, carries it forward, and transforms lives, a lesson Daniel knew he would carry forever, shaping every day he spent with Emily from that night onward.